Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the eDiscovery Channel. This is Tom O'Connor from lovely downtown New Orleans, Louisiana, where we're kind of proceeding with recovery efforts from Hurricane Ida, and hoping we can get through the rest of the fall without any further issues. Joined, as always, by Rocky Messing, the incredibly jet-lagged Rocky Messing, who was actually in the United States in a rare public appearance in the U.S. How long off the plane, Rocky? When did you get off the plane?
About 24 hours.
So, all right. So
no more jet lag. I'm good now.
Oh, so you just rumpled. It's not jet lag. You're just rumpled.
Right. Which is why I need my coffee for
the
this
caffeine.
One, so.
There you go. Well, we're really pleased to be joined this morning by someone I've known for a long time in the business. Rocky, I presume you've known Gene for a while as well. Yeah. Gene Eames, who's
quite a while.
Director of Legal Search and Data Analytics at Pfizer. And I've known him through a couple of iterations of other companies over the year. Curiously, Gene lives in Connecticut half the year, and Rocky is also in Connecticut. And I was just told they're only about 20 minutes apart from each other, which is a rare coincidence in our series. So, good morning, Gene. How you doing?
I'm doing very well, thanks, Tom.
Good,
Rocky.
Good. So, listen, I like to start off with having people tell a little bit about their background. How did you get roped into this wacky business of ours? What made you decide to put down the guitar and pick up the computer?
Well, unfortunately, I'm going to give you kind of the long answer, right? But
right.
I'll try to cut down some of the details. I started working with lawyers. I started working in a law firm environment when I was 16 years old.
Wow.
The very first job I ever had was at Eames of Pfizer at 1 Wall Street as a messenger during my summer breaks. And, so I just got this exposure. It was very different back then, obviously, but I got this exposure to the legal community. And, as I went through high school, college, I, keep going back for summer jobs. It was, something I was, was readily available to me. So that when I finally, got out of school and didn't really know what I was going to do, just like many other people, the situation other people find themselves in.
Well, let me interject there. I'm sorry, Gene. So you got a summer job at 1 Wall Street. So you grew up in New York?
Yeah, I grew up in Brooklyn. So it's not really New York, it's Brooklyn, right? Interestingly, where I grew up, Manhattan was like a foreign country, sort of, right? Even though it was only 8 miles away, right? And, people that I grew up with tended to be pretty provincial, and they kind of went from Brooklyn to Staten Island to New Jersey and occasionally visited Manhattan. I really feel very fortunate that I got into the city pretty early in my life and got exposed to a lot of different kinds of people and a lot of different levels of education. And, I really think back on that, and I'm very thankful that happened.
Great. And then where'd you go to college?
I'm sorry?
Where'd you go to college?
So that's another interesting part of the story. I started at a pharmaceutical school at St. John's University and failed miserably. I bombed out. And I had been an excellent, A+ student my whole life. So it was really sort of a jolting sort of experience for me. And I said, this just isn't for me. I went from a very small specialized high school with, 30 people in a whole, graduating class to gigantic university. And I didn't adjust well. Right. So I left after about a year and decided what I really wanted to do was study philosophy. And I became a philosophy major. And the reason why I think that's interesting is many, many years later, when I was working for Pfizer, the largest pharmaceutical company in the world at the time, somebody referred to me as the Plato of the division. And I had to remind them that's interesting because I failed out of pharmacy school and went to do philosophy. That the juxtaposition of that I found kind of amusing, actually.
Right. It's actually, as an aside, it's really interesting to me how many people in our business, in our profession, started off, and I think there's a correlation between math and science here as well, but started off in college studying philosophy, if not a philosophy major. My own son, Gail and I's son, Seamus, who's working for Joy Morrow now, was a math whiz in high school and kind of switched over to philosophy in college. He came to me his senior year when he was taking all these AP math courses, which of course he might as well have been studying Chinese. He said, "I don't want to take."
Trying to help, but just make it worse.
He said, "I want to drop this class and I want to take a photography class. I want to do something in the arts." And I said, "Why? Is it too hard?" And he said, "No." He said, "It's hard. Don't get me wrong. It's difficult." But he said, "But what it is it's like," he literally used the word, "it's like philosophical. This isn't like anything real. I'm studying this math that the only thing I could ever use it for is to teach other people this math."
Right? Yeah.
Right.
So that's funny, that philosophy background. I know several people in our business, owners of a couple of software companies who started as philosophy majors and then got into engineering or math or whatever. So. Yeah,
I mean, it really, in my mind, paid off pretty well, because then, so when I graduated, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I already had this exposure to the legal community. I said, well, maybe I want to be a lawyer. So I went to work for a law firm in the state, another law firm, Strickland Levan,
sure,
and was a litigation paralegal, thinking I was going to go on to law school. And of course, within a year, I realized I do not want to be a lawyer. and this is when the whole e-discovery thing, well, not e-discovery, but lit support kind of came into play.
Right.
And I've had a number of pretty important mentors in my life. And the first one was Judge Alvin Hellerstein, who I think might be retired from Southern District, New York now, but he was a judge there until recently. I haven't really been following it. But anyway, I was working for Alvin Hellerstein. He was a senior partner at the firm. And this was like in the 80s. And he was like, you know what's going to happen? We're going to have to start using computers more and more for document control. So we're going to need somebody in the firm who just really focuses on that. And he kind of planted that seed in my mind that I then went on to create a business case to create this new position called the litigation support manager. They gave me that role. I wound up staying at that firm for 17 years. Wow. Now, interestingly, that firm wasn't a huge litigation firm. It did a lot of corporate work, a lot of real estate work, trust and estates. They did do litigation, but mostly for clients in their other sort of practice areas, right?
Right.
So what I focused on more was volume of litigation as opposed to the big bet your company litigation, right? So I started building, document management systems, but also started building docketing systems, conflict of interest systems, and really started diving into the use of text-based database systems, SQL database systems, and the marriage of the two, which is, what e-discovery is. Basically, all the e-discovery tools basically do that now.
Yeah.
So, and this was back, in the 80s and 90s, I was doing that. Now, there was no e-discovery at that point, but that went on for.
Gene, sorry, were you mostly building everything on your own, or were you pulling any kind of software and integrating it together? I mean, obviously SQL, but I'm saying, actual.
So, you look back on your career and you say a couple of happy accidents occurred, right? So one was that I met Al Hellerstein, and also Jay Maish was another partner at the firm there who helped me quite a bit in the case management end. But another happy accident was that our firm, unlike most others, had decided to go with a VAX mini computer system with dumb terminals as opposed to a whole bunch of PCs.
Wow.
Well, what that meant was that to buy a license for one of the tools, and we were using a text-based tool called BRS Search, which was, the precursor to DT Search, basically. It was an expensive license. So then the firm wanted to get as much as they could out of it. They weren't paying $2,000 for a license. They were paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for a license. So they kind of let me loose on it and say, what can you do with this? What kinds of things can you do with it? Because we want to return on our investment. And that happy accident allowed me to dive in. They gave me sort of a clear path to kind of do that kind of work. And I really appreciate it. At the same time, when I would go to all the user group meetings, I started palling up with the people outside the litigation support space, right? I was palling with the guys from, you know, Halliburton and from Boeing and from all these big companies, because library sciences was a big thing and other corporate knowledge management.
Knowledge management, right? That's what
you know,
those are the first guys I came across who did this stuff too. Yeah.
Exactly. So my sort of getting into that circle gave me a different perspective. And I really appreciate that happy accident as well. And in fact, Tom, I just remembered this, but I always felt sort of guilty that I was doing this work and I didn't have a computer science background, right? So I went to this class at one point to learn how to use one of the scripting languages, and there was a bunch of guys from Bell Labs there. And we went out to lunch, and I was telling them, you know, they all had their PhDs in computer science, and I felt like a knucklehead, you know. So I told them my story, and one of the guys said, "Well, that's really interesting. We just fired an entire department of computer science majors and hired people with liberal arts backgrounds, because we can teach them the syntax, but we can't teach people how to use logic,
how to think."
And
exactly.
Now, he might have just been nice to me that day and felt sorry for me, but I tell you, that stuck with me and gave me a level of confidence that, you know, allowed me to go forward with my career and you know, do things without feeling guilty about it or feeling like I was underqualified. You know, at a certain point, you know, you just make it happen, right? And it really doesn't matter what your educational background is at that point, as we see throughout life, right? It's more the drive, the motivation, and the series of happy accidents that kind of set the stage for you. Now, you still have to take advantage of those happy accidents, right? So when I talk to younger folks, I say, you know, look, you still got to be on your game, right? But, you know, there is some amount of luck in any success story. I firmly believe, and you know, I've had my fair share of that.
Now, wait a minute. Now I need to interject again here. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I know, and maybe a lot of people who don't know you aren't aware of this, but you also have a parallel path as a musician. So what was going on with that, especially being in New York, right? Like,
so you know, I played.
Was your life saved by rock and roll?
Yeah. So I played an awful lot when I was younger, you know, when I was in college age and even high school age, I was playing a lot.
Yeah.
And then once I started working in a law firm, I didn't really play that much. I mean, it was sporadic. But towards the end of my tenure, and again, I was there for about 17 years. Towards the end of my tenure, I had hired a young gentleman from NYU to work with me. He was a musician. And, you know, I was single at the time, and we started hanging around together, even though he was like 15 years younger than me. And we just started, you know, palling around, and I started sitting in at gigs he was playing at. And then, you know, very interestingly, he had gone to the American School of Paris. And he said, a couple of my friends are coming in from Europe, and one of them lived in LA, and they want to do some music. And, you know, why don't you come down and meet them? And, you know, we'll see what happens, you know, because he had a studio in the city. And it wound up being the sons of Leonard Cohen and the son of Stephen Stills.
Wow.
So I met these two guys, and we totally hit it off. And they were like youngsters. They were like 20 years old at the time. I was, you know, at least 15 years older than them. But we just had a chemistry, and I wound up playing with them for a year and a half, 2 years.
Cool.
And through my playing with them, I just got to meet so many people in the New York music scene because they were so well connected, that then I just had a series of bands that I got into till today, pretty much. So it was, again, you know, I hate to keep repeating this happy accident thing, but, you know, it was just these circumstances arise, and, you know, I wasn't looking for it, and it just kind of landed in my lap.
Yeah, now, you got to seize the opportunity, though. Yeah.
Now, eventually,
it's all actually recognizing that opportunity. Like, you know, the happy accidents happen all the time, but it's the fact that you were able to actually see that, wow, this is something that I can actually use and take advantage of is the advantage that some people have and some people just miss out, unfortunately. So
and you know, who knows how many I missed, Rocky. You know.
Yeah.
But you've done okay for yourself so far.
Yeah.
You know, now, but with the music scene, you know, look, I still had to let my career come first. You know, no matter what happened to music, I love it, and I did love it even more so back then when I was playing a lot of really good bands. But it wasn't going to be the way I was going to support my family. So I really needed to focus on you know the career that I had ahead of me at the same time, and I was able to balance it. My wife helped me balance it. You know, at one point I was playing in about 4 or 5 different bands. She goes, no, 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 no. Pick one. Which I thought was a fair compromise.
So that took you, this is taking you into basically the early 2000s when you left the firm? Right?
Actually, it was the late, it was like 97 I left, right? And
Okay,
then I went on to, I decided I really didn't want, e-discovery wasn't really a big thing. It had started by then, but it hadn't really taken off. I had met this gentleman who, through the BRS search connection, right? Because there was a whole community of people that built applications off of that search engine. And he had done a lot of work in, it was a small consulting firm in Connecticut, which is why I live in Connecticut, actually. It was a company called Kame Associates, a gentleman named Ed Kame, and he did a lot of work for pharmaceutical companies. He did work for publishing companies and so on. And he was looking to build knowledge management systems. So, you know, because I had this connection with all those corporate folks through the BRS users group, you know, I had these ideas on how to marry together a SQL environment and a text-based search engine environment. And I wound up building knowledge management applications, and I did them for, you know, major financial institutions, for publishing houses again, and I started doing a lot of work in pharmaceutical, doing drug safety data, you know, kind of offshoots of drug safety database, not the adverse event reporting, but like sort of systems that would monitor all the public reports that were out there, all the public journals that were out there, and sort of consolidate and do some deep parsing of some of their metadata. And I spent a long time doing that. I spent about 7 years doing that. Unfortunately, that company, you know, lost a couple of its big clients, kind of wasn't going to sustain my career any further. Let's just put it that way. And I reached out to a really good buddy of mine that was in the industry at the time, Charlie Otto, who you guys may, Charlie, Rob, I'm sure you know Charlie Otto. And I said, look, I need to get back into the litigation support space. You know, here's what my background is. I mean, he knew me already, so he knew I had done lit support, but, you know, I hadn't done e-discovery per se, you know. But I had done a lot of work in the taxonomies, and I obviously knew a lot about text search capabilities and different analytic tools. So I met up with him, and that was when they were creating SPI with the original folks from EDI, right? So it was, you know, Ken Shear, David Kittrell, Charlie Otto, you know, some really bright guys who really knew what they were doing. And so I went to work at SPI, and I think that's where I met you, Rocky, through SPI, probably when we were in Austin. And I stayed there until that kind of imploded because of their offshore ownership. And when I went to SPI, the first client I had was Pfizer. I worked as a project manager of all things because they would, you know, it was a fledgling company and they just needed project managers.
I'm do whatever it takes.
Exactly. I'm not really, it's not my passion to be a project manager, although I have done it, obviously. But that's what I did, and I started learning a lot of the analytics stuff. I started being taught by David Kittrell in particular, who to me is one of the smartest technologists I've met in the space. He has now passed away, unfortunately, but he was a big influence on me, and probably one of my biggest mentors that I've had in this industry. So I stayed there. When that kind of fell apart, I went to Dages for a short while because some of the Pfizer data had flowed there, but had reached out to Pfizer and said, look, I really like working on your docket. And then they reached out to me and said, you know, look, there's an opportunity to come in-house, and I took that, and I've now been inside Pfizer for 11 years.
Good. So, without getting into any specifics of stuff, talk a little bit about the I mean, case specifics or project specifics. Talk a little bit, if you could, about the evolution of search, about the tools. You know, you talked about where you started. What's the different steps you've seen that have gone on since then?
Well, you know, obviously the marketing has changed a lot, right? And you know, a good text indexing system allowing text search hasn't changed that much, to tell you the truth, right? Now, the ability to extract more comprehensive text out of documents that you can then index and search has gotten a lot better.
Right.
You know, because it's never, you know, there's a bunch of components involved in any of this work, right? Whether people realize it or not, they just look at an interface, they think that's one thing, but it may be 10 things sitting under the covers, right?
Right.
So, you know, the inverted file technology, which allows for text indexing so that you can search a word within proximity of another word and not just do a string search. That, you know, that was pretty well developed back in the 90s already, right? I mean, it all came from IBM Stairs. BRS Search was actually sort of an offshoot of IBM Stairs, only made for, you know, the Linux environment, made for more portable environments.
Right.
And DT Search has very similar technology. You know, so on the straightforward search side of things, it hasn't changed that much. And now how that gets integrated into SQL, how that gets integrated, you know, the processes for extracting more comprehensive text, OCR, you know, uncovering hidden text within electronic documents, that's changed a lot. And that has had a profound impact on the ultimate result, which is what matters, right? I mean, it isn't about how good your index is. It's about, did your search terms find the documents you were looking for and not leave too many behind, right?
So the other side of that, or not the other side, but a different piece of that is the explosion in the size of data sets, right?
Yeah, so I mean, that is, you know, you have to be able to index much larger sets, right? Or figure out ways to cull them down
to
in a validated sort of way, so that you're not indexing things you don't need to index, right?
Right.
So that goes on. And then, of course, that's living with this, you know, whole new predictive modeling, all this, you know, exemplar-based sort of classification systems, which, you know, there's been a long-standing fight in the industry now that it's one or the other, and one necessarily works better than the other, and one never works, and one always works, which is all nonsense. It's like they're tools that both can work really well, or they might not work too well at all, depending on how you implement them. And that, you know, in my argument, as you guys probably have heard me say many times before, it's kind of besides the point. Measure how well you did. Did you actually accomplish what you were looking to accomplish? And if you do accomplish what you were trying to accomplish, what difference does it make which tool you use?
Yes.
You know,
you made a point once at a presentation, this is a number of years ago when we were first starting to get into this field, but you compared it to some of the early, you compared this conundrum to some of the early days of OCR technology, where there's a dozen different engines. And you said, you know, if you have, and some people back then would use 2 or 3 different OCR engines and then, you know, compare the results and see which one did the best. And you said, now that's of course much more difficult in this world because the products are more expensive, but still it's a continuation of that sort of an approach, is what tool is giving you the results that you need, and then so that's the best tool for that specific instance. Well, it's not the best tool for everything. Yeah.
And you know, look, without even buying a lot of tools, you know, as long as you can take random samples of populations, what you want and what you left behind, you know, you can at least get some sense of how well you did.
And I'm surprised how few people do that still. That random sampling is not used as a standard modus operandi, if you will. Like, you know, especially again as the data sets increase, it seems to me that it's not just better for getting you the results you need, but also a more effective, efficient way to work. You don't want to start pinging everything.
Let's just start with, forget about random sample. Let's just start with measurement in general. People aren't thinking about actual quality, and how do you actually measure quality, and how do you actually determine if something is successful or not? They're just worried about getting the job done. And
Right.
in their definition, unfortunately, getting the job done just means that I've passed through, these phases, these stages, and I'm good to go. It doesn't matter whether or not it actually worked the way that it's supposed to. But I think that the key is the fact that even with the expense of some of these tools, if you take the same classifier and you run it multiple times with just slightly different inputs, then you can improve on whatever you're trying to. Again, it's all situational, but you don't have to spend a lot of money. It just might take a little bit more time.
Yeah.
And I think with the computing power now, it allows us to do that in ways that, you couldn't do 15, 20 years ago, unless you were truly willing to spend the time doing it.
I was smiling there because, I do a lot of work, a lot of pro bono work with the Federal Defender's Office. And we get spoiled there because as one attorney said when we were in the middle of a presentation of some new e-discovery tool a couple of years ago, he said, look, when I get the data from the government, there's only one thing I'm looking for right off the bat. I want to see how many times my guy is mentioned. I'm searching for my guy's name, right? And if he's only mentioned 10 times in all of this document, like, my work here is done, right?
Right.
But we also have an advantage in that space because we're given the search terms and the date parameters and the proper names. It's called an indictment, right? We've got real specific documents that tell us what we're looking for, and all we have to do is, take that information out of the indictment and use it. It makes our jobs a lot easier. Not something, of course, in the civil world that is a prominent feature. But I'm sorry, I interrupted you there, Gene.
No, look, I think you're right. What makes it a little more challenging, depending upon what your company does, right? And Rachi and I have had this conversation. He's not in a lot of asymmetrical litigation at Microsoft, right? Pharmaceutical companies are always in asymmetrical litigation. Not always, but often.
Yes, the vast majority.
And, look, if all we had to do was find the important documents, it would be a lot easier. But that's not what it becomes about where there's this combative sort of weaponization of discovery, right? So you have a higher bar, and it creates a lot more expense and a lot more effort. So we kind of use statistics and sampling to kind of fight that fight. Say, look, I've always been a big proponent of proportionality, not necessarily being what you can afford, right? Because big companies can afford a lot, but like, what value are you getting out of the exercise? That should be the proportionality argument. Like, what are we netting?
Appropriate.
Yeah, exactly. Because you don't want to fight the fight with a judge saying, Pfizer can't afford to do that.
It's not right. It's not worth the money because
it's just not going to land well. But if you can say, look, if you make us do that, it's going to be over 99% ineffective, right? Like, how does that make sense for anybody? Or whatever the statistics tell you, right?
Yeah.
And we've been able to get our outside counsel to fight that fight a little bit more because, like, even cost sharing is hard to do when you're a big giant company with deep pockets, right? Because people tend not to get the numbers in context, right?
Well, this tactfully said.
So I guess one of the questions is, when we start talking about data and numbers and statistics and all of the fun things that, Gene, you and I have had hours of conversations about, but a lot of people, and especially the attorneys, outside counsel, half the time, they don't even want to hear it. They just don't want to go down that road. And partially because they don't understand it, partially because they feel that they're going to have trouble if it gets into the weeds of actually explaining it. So how have you, over the last 10, 15 years. What kind of steps have you done? What have you taken in terms of your approach to get people comfortable with data, with actual statistics, actual, here is what we're talking about, and as opposed to just going based off of the high level numbers?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all in how you create sort of an executive summary for them, right? Like, you can't get too much into the weeds. You just have to say, look, this effort is not going to be all that effective. This is the result we can expect within some margin of error, right? Now, sometimes even that's too much, right? So don't get me wrong. Like, there are times when we just have to do it. I mean, my philosophy has always been, prepare ourselves to do the best we can possibly do and make it such that when we get forced to do something really stupid, it doesn't kill us, right? Because inevitably we're going to get forced to do something that doesn't make any sense, right? And you have to make sure that when you're forced into doing that it's, you can do it as efficiently and as cost effectively as you possibly can, because it's inevitable. It's going to happen. We have a big docket. We have, hundreds, if not thousands, of cases we have to deal with over the course of a series of years. So, you just do the best you can, right? I mean, we've been pretty fortunate that we work with the same outside counsel very often, so they kind of get it after a while. And but the opposing counsel almost never gets it. And it's up to our counsel to decide how hard they're going to fight, and there's a lot of parameters that go into that, I'm sure, and that's what we have lawyers for, right? I mean, they figure that out, right? Like, what's the judge like? What's, is it worth it? Is there some other fight we'd rather fight? And then in that way, when we do have the ability to do even dumb things, not too expensively, if we lose that fight, it's not going to kill us.
Right. And I guess part of, and anytime that, for an e-discovery professional, part of it is accepting and knowing when to step back and when to say, okay, I did my job. I gave you the info, and it's on you. It's for decisions to determine how best to use it. And I think a lot of people in this industry get frustrated with that because they spend so much time in data, dealing with the data, figuring these things out, and they lose focus of why are we doing this to begin with, right? It's not just to review the data to review the data, and it's not just to process the data or to analyze. It's to actually win the case, and that's where you have to rely on the people who are going to win it for you.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not an attorney, right? So I've been working with attorneys since I was 16, but I'm not one myself. I report directly to Ed Gramling, who's Associate General Counsel, Discovery Counsel for Pfizer, and then work directly with our outside counsel. I defer to their judgment. They know more about the big picture of the litigation, as you say, Rocky. Like, they have a much better perspective of what the mission is, right? I just know that, part of their mission is for us to meet our discovery obligations, right? And I want to do that as effectively as we can, right? And do it within some reasonable budget, which again is all relative. So, interestingly, though, over the last year or two, so I've been doing mostly work on production, matters, meeting those production obligations. And of course, we do support our internal investigations and some monitoring as well, which does not have a production element to it. But really interesting to me is on the litigation front, we started doing a lot more work on depot prep and trial prep. So now, it gets to be less of the gamesmanship of meeting your discovery obligations and actually finding the real documents that are going to be used.
Interesting.
And, we've spent much of the last year doing more and more of that kind of work. And it's really fun. I mean, it adds a whole new level of interest, because now you're working more directly with your outside counsel on substantive issues and not on like discovery fights, right? But like, what actually happened in this litigation? Like what defenses do we have? What claims can we make? So you're back in the game a little bit. So that has added a bit of interest for me this year. The last year and a half of that.
Yes, I'm curious. Have you either self-developed or have you found anything off the shelf? Obviously, when you start doing that, it's all about storytelling. It's all about putting together the pieces and actually making things make sense overall there in terms of how to find those key documents, but not just find them, but like how they all work together. Have you come across anything or have you built anything that's helping you in doing that?
Well, we've been looking, but what we found is that mostly we can just repurpose a lot of the tools we've already been using, including the proprietary tools we built, right? So like, look, when you make a big production, it's highly duplicative. It's not all entirely relevant. It's technically responsive, right? I mean, we had to produce it, but it's not going to be used, most of it, right? So we're using a lot of the same efficiencies that we have for production review for this this depot prep work, right? Where we're doing single instance review, where, we're making sure we're reviewing as few documents we can to get all the substance we need. We're freely using more of the analytics tools because we don't have to defend it, right? So we're using content clustering, we're using textual similarity clustering, we're using predictive modeling, at will, right? Because we don't have to get permission from anybody to do that. All we have to do is find the best documents. And then even you find a bunch of documents, but let's face it, you find 100 documents that say the same thing. They're different documents. You can't show all 100 of them to a witness, on one particular issue. So then we figured out ways to find the best example of that document, working with our outside counsel and to the extent possible, use technology to help us get there, but, assisted by human review, right? But we're using our outside legal managed resources to do that much less expensively, as agents of our outside, trial counsel. So, it's really been working very, very well. Now, we are looking at other tools to help put together binders and things like that. We're not entirely sold on any of them yet. Some of them are a little kludgy. We still have big volumes, right? So, as everything, as every tool that comes to us, we discover very quickly is it looks great until you try to do it to scale, right? And almost everything we do is at pretty high scale. So, it works great for 200 documents, but how does it work for 200,000,
or 2 million or
exactly.
20 million.
Exactly.
Right. So I want to ask a little bit of a different question. I would think, working at Pfizer, pharmaceutical, that a lot of the cases aren't necessarily truly dependent on emails, text messages, unstructured data. But I would imagine that there's a decent sized structured data analysis piece that goes along with it. Is that something that your team, first of all, am I totally off base there? Or, but, is that something that your team gets involved with? And if so, are you finding that you're able to do some correlations between the unstructured data and what's being found within the structured data sets?
Yeah, well, certainly structured data is a big part of some of the litigation. We have different classes of litigation, right? But,
of course,
obviously, if you're in a products case, the safety database is going to be pretty important, right? And now, but that doesn't stop people from trying to get the same information out of your email, right? My argument has always been, look, there's a system of record. I mean, why don't you just go to that? That's where all the safety data is, right? So we've been dealing with that, since 2004 when I first started consulting with Pfizer, right? So we do oversee that. We have subject matter experts on the structured data end. People who actually know those systems who help us get that data out. It all gets managed by our discovery managers, who are in-house folks who kind of quarterback this whole thing. Some of it goes into our normal review environment. Some of it can't, depending upon what data it is. But we figure out ways to do whatever review has to be done on it, assuming that we do have to review it, and you know, we take care of it. Now correlating it between structured and unstructured, you know, I would suggest there's a lot of duplicative information, but you know, there are systems of record you go to. Like if you were looking to see what my expenses were, don't go to my email, go to the expense tracking system, because if I don't put it in there, I don't get my money back, right?
It doesn't matter.
So, you know, that's sort of a game we have to play sometimes, but you know, again, it depends upon the type of litigation. I wouldn't say that email is going away, and certainly now, you know, with the pandemic, has sped up the adoption of Teams chat and Teams channels and all the other communication that we have available, which we knew was coming and it was inevitable anyway. It's just, as most companies, I'm sure the pandemic just sped that up really quickly. So we're, you know, as you well know, Rocky, we're always trying to stay ahead of that game and trying to make sure we've got that handled. And I think we're doing pretty well. We work a lot with you guys at Microsoft, and you know, we have a collection vendor that we work with, and we're constantly trying to stay a step ahead of the game so that we don't get, you know, we're not flat-footed when we have to review.
No surprises.
Yeah, I mean, it's all discoverable information, right? So we have to just, you know, I spend a lot of my time, besides the time I've been spending on the depot prep work, which is somewhat a new initiative for us. I spend a lot of my time just, you know, looking into the crystal ball, saying what's coming next with all these new collaborative platforms, right? Like, and what are we going to do with it?
Right.
And, you know, because it's not just getting it, it's not just collecting it,
right,
but it's making it sensibly reviewable, right? Yeah. Like you've got to put it together in a way that a lawyer can look at it and make sense out of what people were saying to each other, right? And that's really where some of the challenge comes from. I mean, I don't feel very comfortable when people say, "Oh, we successfully collected it." Yeah, but what does it look like?
Yeah, what are we going to do with it? Yeah,
yeah. Right. Zeros and ones ain't going to help no one. So, exactly. That's the name of, you know, Gene's next song that coming out with. So
binary blues.
Binary blues. So one last question from me before I turn it over to Tom to close us out. You know, you've been on the cutting edge of a lot of this technology for a while, and you know, I think a lot of the people within the industry recognize that a lot of the things that you're doing are things that are, you know, you were doing 10 years ago have just started now becoming commonplace or some of them not even yet. What do you see in terms of what's coming? Like, what are some of the things that you are looking at now that you're like, okay, we're going to start doing this, and you know what? We're going to be ahead of the curve, and in another 5-10 years, people will start doing this as commonplace. Are there anything out there, or is it just more advanced of the same?
I think, right.
Or is that a trade secret you don't want to talk about? Either way.
Well, what I will divulge is right now I'm sort of myself and, you know, other team members are on reactive mode, right? Because this is a new world going. You know, everybody's moving off prem into the cloud, right? And it just changes everything, right? I mean, it just changes the way people are working. It changes the data sources that we have to get. So we're really kind of focusing on being reactive to that. We are, you know, to the extent we're looking into the crystal ball, it's like, what other things are going to get rolled out? Maybe we'll know about it, maybe we won't, right? But, you know, how are we going to deal with that? So you're building a framework for how you would deal with that kind of data. You know, you're going to separate, you know, I've always been a big fan of separating things that were intentionally created user content versus things that are sort of artifacts, right? Now, artifacts might have a purpose in a forensic examination if you have some criminal investigation or something like that. But in most civil litigation, I think, you know, it's the intentionally created content that we're really looking for, you know, where there's substantive content that can be reviewed and sort of indicates what somebody might have said or done, right? So we have the framework for kind of looking at all these new sort of implementations that are coming through the cloud, you know, through these cloud rollouts, and saying, you know, what is that going to look like? How are we going to play? You know, how is that going to impact us on the discovery side? Because, you know, we have this dichotomy. You've got, you know, the digital, our IT organization is called digital, right? like they justifiably are looking to the future, right? Like it's not affordable to do on-prem systems anymore, right? So you have to go to the cloud, right? There's just no choice, right? And that's sort of the way of the future, right? And they're doing what they're supposed to be doing for the company. But in doing so, they're creating these unintended consequences for investigations and discovery. And we're pretty fortunate that we work with those guys quite a bit, and we have an open line of communication. But it's fast moving, and it's really hard. Like we can't guess all the things that are going to impact us negatively or positively until they happen sometimes, right? And it's, I often tell people it's very different than what we had in the past where, before a change would be made to a Pfizer laptop, it went through series of regression testing and all kinds of, the golden PC, right? That they always used to talk about, right? So you weren't going to get anything that the IT organization didn't know fully what its impact was going to be. Well, those days are gone, right? Like, Rocky, that your environment can change overnight, right? Because you're changing it for the world, right? Not, like you just don't have Pfizer as a client or, individual companies. It's like everybody. So, we went from this very controlled environment to this kind of Wild West, right? And that's where we're spending a lot of our efforts now, right? So it's not like what new technology is going to make this easy. No, there's no technology that's going to really make it easy, right? It's always going to be the same framework, right? You're going to find a tool that works pretty well, and you're going to have to test it. You're going to have to iterate through it, right? And you're probably going to have some human driving that, right? Because I've never seen any tool that's come out that didn't require that. So, I'm in that stage right now where we're just sort of reacting, not as much being proactive.
So a lot of people will listen to that and they might say, that just sounds negative, right? Like change and it's hard and it's difficult and you never know what's coming. What are there positives there, like that you see for you and your organization, like that are actually making life easier in some ways, or is it? And feel free to just say nope. It just makes things more complex and
no. I mean, look. I mean, I enjoy the benefits as a colleague at Pfizer doing my day-to-day work. I mean, look, the fact that the three of us are sitting here talking to each other, the technology is good, right? I mean, it's
well, except when I drop off, but yeah.
And look, I'm not against, like. I am not at all against forward progress, right? That's necessary. A company can't exist if it doesn't move forward, right? You wouldn't be able to hire new people if you didn't have new technology. So it's not intended to be a negative sort of view of it. It's just sort of a realistic view of it, right? That the reality is that in the act of moving forward, which you have to do and it's unavoidable, you're going to create consequences, right? And somebody's going to have to deal with those consequences because, I've talked to judges about this and they're like, look, you can't blame Microsoft or any other technology provider for the fact that you can't get data that the other side is entitled to, right? You chose to use them, whether we did choose or not. I mean, it might have been just, unavoidable, but that's the reality, right? Like we have an obligation. It's our folks' data, right? We have to be able to corral it. We have to be able to make it reviewable. We have to be able to produce it because that's our obligation. So, I hope it doesn't come across as negative and it comes across more as just realistic. I don't fight with digital about moving forward. They have to. It would be a losing battle if I tried to fight it. Like you can't avoid it.
Yeah. Right. Okay, so Tom, let's take it home.
All right, coming down the home stretch. So, Gene, first question is a simple one, but as I mentioned earlier, right down the wheelhouse of your musical background. Beatles or Stones?
I'd have to say Beatles.
Oh God.
Yes.
Sorry, Tom.
I think this.
Tom, does that mean you won't allow me to go to your crawfish boils anymore?
That's right. You're going down to the bottom of the guest list, my friend. Okay, so the bigger question, the one we ask everybody at the end, if you could spend a day with anybody from our profession who you've met, it could be somebody living or somebody who's left us, but you could spend a day doing anything you want. That could be not necessarily work related. It could be, as I said, taking a hike someplace, going to a concert, going into New York and listening to a band, whatever you do. Who would that be and what would you do?
So I mentioned him earlier, and it would be David Kittrell, who I met in 2004. David was an amazing technologist who wrote the very first e-discovery tool for EDI. He had done a lot of work at Microsoft. He's a Seattle guy, and I don't even know that we would talk about work. I mean, I used to, he was sort of a private guy, but I spent a lot of time with him in Austin, Texas, when we were working at SBI together. And he always knew the greatest restaurants. And he had originally come from the South, and he knew a lot about Southern food. And I would just go out and let him pick the restaurant and just go out and just enjoy all of the things that he wanted me to try out and sort of teach me about, because I really missed that. And he was an amazing guy. And if we were going to talk about work, I'd want to get his blessing that what I'm doing is still sort of on track, because he's been in my head since I first met him. And everything that I do, I kind of use him sort of as a guide to saying, is this a smart thing to do or not?
Right.
He was a pretty amazing guy. I know, Rocky, you met him. I don't know if you ever met him, Tom, but I think it's great that you have
casually once or twice at some shows. We never became close to each other, but I knew who he is. I know who he is or was, and had the pleasure of having brief conversations with him a couple of times.
And I will say this, although it's not tie-dye, your shirt is close enough to his iconic tie-dye shirt and the big white beard. I'm almost looking at David Kittrell.
Nice. All right. Well, Gene, thanks for your time and your observations as always. I hope it's not too much longer before I get to see you someplace in person. This whole COVID thing is just really put a dent in our ability to interface with each other. And again, as I said earlier, that's one of the reasons we do these interviews, is to get people out there in front of the rest of the folks in our audience. And you normally would have a chance to say hi to you and talk to you at maybe at Legal Tech, maybe at EDI or Ilticon, whatever. But those things are sort of by the board now. So we appreciate you taking the time and sharing your memories with us, and look forward to seeing you again in the future.
Nice to see you guys. And Tom, hopefully in the spring we'll be back at the Jazz Fest.
Hopefully things will recover and we'll be around. I ran into Quentin Davis, the guy who runs the whole thing. He has a house here in my neighborhood, and I ran into him at the gas station the other day, and he was just like, "Yeah, we got to do it." He said, "It's driving me nuts. I gotta do this thing." I said, "Oh, I got people just dying for crawfish. When you gotta pull this off? Come on." So, anyways, thanks again, Gene. Look forward to seeing you in person. And Rocky, great to have you here in the continental United States again. And
thank you.
Hope to run into you also in person sometime in the not too distant future. So, thanks everybody for joining in, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time on the eDiscovery channel.
Okay, see you guys soon. Bye.